When a person sits beside a quiet lake at dusk watching the last light dissolve into water, a question arises in the silence. What is it that truly burns and what remains untouched? The wise have long observed that fear is a fire that consumes not the body first but the mind, and among all fears none grips more deeply than the fear of death. It creeps into thought like smoke through hidden cracks, coloring joy with hesitation and making even the present moment feel borrowed. Yet there is a teaching found in still awareness. Just as a lotus rises from muddy water yet is never stained by it, so too can the awakened heart exist within the world of change without being consumed by it. The fire may burn around it, but its essence remains untouched. Death in its ordinary understanding appears as an ending, but look closer and it is revealed as transformation. The body returns to the elements as waves return to the ocean. What rises and falls is form. What observes the rising and falling is not bound by form. Fear arises when one mistakes the wave for the ocean, when one believes the passing shape is the entirety of being. The lotus does not resist the water from which it grows. It does not struggle against the mud, nor does it fear the sun that will one day dry its petals. It simply unfolds moment by moment according to its nature. In the same way, when life is met without resistance, even the thought of death loses its sharp edge. It is resistance that creates suffering. When one clings tightly to what is already flowing away, anxiety is born. When one tries to hold the breath of life as if it were stone, fear becomes constant companion. But when the hand is opened, even loss becomes movement rather than wound. To remain untouched by the fear of death does not mean to deny its existence. It means to see clearly that what truly is cannot be harmed by what changes. The body may age, illness may arrive, and endings may come as they must, yet awareness itself is not diminished by the passing of its temporary forms. Consider the flame of a lamp. It appears steady, yet it is in constant motion, renewed each moment by unseen causes. If the lamp is extinguished, one might say the flame has ended. But the space that held light was never owned by the flame alone. In the same way, life is not confined to a single expression. It is part of a greater unfolding that does not begin with birth or end with death. When this is seen, fear begins to lose its authority. Not suddenly, not violently, but like mist dissolving under morning light. What remains is a quiet acceptance, a spaciousness in which life can be lived fully without the shadow of constant dread. To live as a lotus in the fire is to stand in the midst of impermanence without becoming defined by it. Pleasure comes and goes. Pain comes and goes. Gain and loss follow one another like the turning of seasons. Yet beneath all of it is a stillness that does not move, even when everything else does. This stillness is not something to be created. It is discovered when the noise of grasping quiets. When one stops running from what is inevitable and stops chasing what cannot be held, a deeper clarity emerges. In that clarity, death is no longer an enemy waiting at the end of a road, but a doorway that does not threaten the traveler who understands they are not the road itself. So one learns to walk gently, to speak, to love, to give without the constant weight of fear pressing upon each moment. The breath becomes lighter, the heart becomes open. Even sorrow is no longer a chain but a passing weather in the vast sky of awareness. And in this way the lotus remains untouched, not because fire does not exist, but because its nature is not defined by what surrounds it. Fear of death is rooted in misunderstanding impermanence. The speech explains that fear arises when we identify too strongly with the body and believe change or endings are absolute loss, rather than natural transformation. Fear of death is not born from death itself, but from the way the mind misunderstands what is always changing. At the deepest level, it arises from the habit of believing that what is temporary is permanent, and that what is flowing is fixed. A human body is seen, touched, named, and therefore assumed to be a solid self. Yet in truth it is a continuous process, breath entering and leaving, cells forming and dissolving, thoughts appearing and disappearing like ripples on water. When this natural movement is not understood, the mind builds an idea of ownership. This is me, this is mine, this will last. From that fragile foundation, the fear of death grows like a shadow that follows every step. Impermanence is not a punishment or a flaw in existence, it is the very texture of existence. Everything that is formed must change, and everything that is gathered must disperse. Day turns into night without asking permission. Seasons arrive and depart without consultation. Even the mountains, which appear unmoving, are slowly returning to dust through time too vast for the human eye to measure. Yet the mind, caught in its desire for stability, resists this truth. It wants life to be an object it can hold rather than a river it must learn to flow with. This resistance creates a subtle confusion. Instead of seeing life as a moment-to-moment unfolding, the mind constructs a story of continuity centered on a fixed identity. It says, I was, I am, I will be, as if the present moment is a possession rather than a passing reality. Because of this construction, death appears as a sudden interruption, a violent ending to something that was imagined to be unbroken. But what is called interruption is only the mind waking up to what was always happening change without pause. When impermanence is misunderstood, even joy becomes fragile. Happiness is clung to tightly because it is believed to be something that must be preserved. But anything held too tightly begins to feel threatened. The fear of losing what is pleasant gives rise to anxiety even while it is still present. In this way, suffering is not only found in loss but also in the effort to prevent loss. The mind becomes like a person trying to stop the wind from moving, forgetting that movement is its nature. To understand impermanence correctly is not to become cold or detached from life. It is to see life more clearly without distortion. It is to recognize that every moment is complete in itself, not because it lasts, but because it is alive only while it is here. When this is seen, the idea of death loses its sharpness. It is no longer an enemy approaching from the future, but the natural completion of what was never fixed in the first place. In this clarity, fear begins to loosen. The body still lives its cycle, and the mind still experiences its waves of emotion. But beneath them there is a growing understanding that nothing solid is being destroyed, only forms are changing. Just as a flame appears continuous though it is renewed each moment, life also is a stream of changing conditions rather than a single unbroken object. Thus, the fear of death is revealed to be the fear of misunderstanding life itself. And when understanding deepens, what once appeared as an ending is seen as part of a wider unfolding that was never confined to beginning or end. Awareness is not destroyed by physical death. While the body changes and eventually returns to nature, the observing awareness is described as something deeper that is not limited or harmed by physical form. The fear of death often hides in the background of human thought, shaping decisions, relationships, and even silence, yet it is rarely looked at directly. It is not simply the fear of a final moment, but the fear of losing everything that is known, held, and identified with. The body, the name, the memories, the roles played in life all are gathered into a sense of me, and within that construction, death appears as total disappearance. But this appearance is based on a misunderstanding of what is actually present in each moment of living. When the mind is not observing closely, it assumes continuity where there is only movement. It treats identity as something fixed, like a statue standing against time. But in lived experience, nothing remains exactly the same even for a fraction of a second. Thoughts arise and fade. Emotions shift without instruction. The body changes quietly from morning to night. Even perception is never identical from one moment to the next. What is called life is not a single object that continues, but a flow of ever-changing events appearing in awareness. Because of this misunderstanding, death is imagined as a rupture in continuity. The mind believes there is a solid line called my life, and at some point that line will be cut. This creates deep resistance because anything that appears as an ending to may is experienced as threat. But if what is called may is not a fixed line but a stream of moments, then what is actually ending? Only the idea of permanence is collapsing, not something that was ever truly solid. Much of human suffering comes from trying to hold what cannot be held. The mind reaches out to secure experiences, relationships, and even identity itself, as if stability can be created by effort. Yet life is not designed to remain still. Everything in existence is in motion, and that motion includes both coming and going. When this movement is resisted, fear becomes constant companion. It is not death alone that creates fear, but the refusal to accept that change is the nature of all things. If observed more deeply, even the body that is feared to be lost is already in a process of continuous renewal. Cells are born and die without pause. Breath enters and leaves without ownership. There is no moment in which the body is exactly the same as it was before. In this sense, change is not something that happens at the end of life, it is what life is made of from beginning to end. When this understanding begins to settle, something subtle shifts. The urgency to cling begins to soften. Experiences are no longer grasped with desperation because their passing nature is seen clearly. Joy is still joy, but it is not burdened with the demand to last forever. Pain is still felt, but it is not multiplied by resistance. Life becomes lighter, not because difficulties disappear, but because the mind stops fighting the basic truth of change. In this space of acceptance, the fear of death loses its central power. It may still appear as a thought, but it no longer defines the whole of experience. What remains is a quiet recognition that everything arising is already in motion, and nothing that is part of this movement can truly be owned or lost in the way the mind imagines. Death, then, is no longer the opposite of life, but part of the same unfolding process. And when life is seen without the distortion of fixed identity, what once felt like an ending begins to appear as simply another expression of change within a much larger, ongoing mystery. Clinging creates suffering, not change itself. Suffering comes from resisting what is already flowing, life, aging, loss. When we cling tightly to what is impermanent, fear and anxiety grow. The fear of death is often experienced as a deep tightening within the mind, a subtle but persistent tension that arises whenever life is examined too closely. It is not only the thought of dying that disturbs the heart, but the sense that everything familiar, everything known, and everything held as self may one day dissolve without trace. This creates an inner conflict, a desire to live fully, and at the same time a fear that life itself is moving toward its disappearance. Yet this conflict is based on a misunderstanding of what life actually is in its living reality. When attention is placed carefully on the present moment, it becomes clear that life is not a fixed structure moving through time, but a continuous unfolding of changing experiences. There is seeing, hearing, feeling, thinking, each arising and passing without interruption. In this flow, no solid object called self can be found as something permanent. What is found instead is a sequence of events, each dependent on conditions, each dissolving as the next appears. The idea of a permanent identity is something constructed by memory and thought, not something directly observed in experience. Because the mind relies heavily on memory, it creates a sense of continuity, stitching together moments into a story. This story feels stable, as if there is a single traveler moving through time, but this stability is an illusion formed by thought. In reality, there is only the present moment endlessly renewing itself. When death is considered from within the framework of the story, it appears as the final chapter. But when seen without that framework, what is called death is simply the ending of a narrative structure, not the destruction of something truly solid. The fear of death grows stronger when attention is constantly drawn into the future. The mind imagines a moment when everything will stop and then reacts emotionally to that imagination as if it were already happening. In this way, fear is not about direct experience, but about mental projection. The body is alive in the present, but the mind travels ahead and creates suffering in advance. This forward movement of thought becomes the ground on which anxiety stands. Yet when attention returns to the present, something different is noticed. In this immediacy, there is no experience of death. There is only life expressing itself in various forms, breathing, sensing, responding. Even the thought of death is itself a present occurrence, arising and fading like all other thoughts. It does not carry the weight of ultimate truth unless it is believed and held onto. As understanding deepens, the need to cling begins to weaken. The mind starts to see that everything it tries to hold, youth, identity, relationships, achievements, is already in motion, already changing. Nothing remains in place long enough to be secured. This realization does not lead to despair, but to a quiet relaxation of effort. The constant struggle to preserve what is already flowing begins to soften. In this softening, fear loses its sharpness. Death is no longer imagined as an enemy approaching from outside, but as part of the same movement that is already happening within life itself. Just as breathing has an in-breath and an out-breath, existence has appearing and disappearing as one continuous rhythm. One is not separate from the other. What remains is a clearer way of seeing. Life is not a possession, and therefore it cannot be lost in the way the mind fears. It is a living process, unfolding moment by moment, beyond ownership and beyond fixed identity. When this is understood even slightly, the weight of fear begins to lift, and what remains is a quiet openness to whatever comes and goes within the vastness of experience. The lotus symbolizes purity within impermanence, like a lotus growing in muddy water yet remaining untouched. A calm mind can live within a changing, uncertain world without being defined or stained by it. However, impermanence is not destruction, it is the natural expression of existence. Everything that appears does so through conditions, and everything that disappears does so when those conditions change. There is no moment in which anything exists independently of causes and relationships. Even the sense of I arises through a network of influences: language, memory, perception, and environment. What is conditioned cannot be permanent, and what is not permanent cannot truly be possessed. When this is seen clearly, the fear of death begins to lose its authority. It is not that death has changed, but that the interpretation of life has changed. Instead of seeing life as a possession belonging to a separate self, it is seen as a continuous unfolding of processes. In such a view, death is no longer the annihilation of something solid, but the natural completion of a form that was always in motion. There is also a deeper shift that occurs when attention rests more fully in present experience. In the immediacy of the present, there is no actual encounter with death. There is only the direct experience of living, breathing, sensing, perceiving. Death exists only as a thought projected into the future. When that projection is seen for what it is, its emotional weight begins to weaken. It is recognized as an idea, not a present reality. With continued understanding, the mind begins to loosen its grip on certainty. It no longer demands that life be fixed or guaranteed. This loosening is not indifference, but clarity. Life is appreciated more fully precisely because it is not permanent. Each moment gains a sense of depth when it is not taken for granted as something that will always continue in the same form. In this way, the fear of death gradually transforms. It is no longer a constant shadow over existence, but a reminder of impermanence itself. And impermanence, once understood rather than resisted, becomes not a source of fear, but the very condition that allows life to be alive, fresh, and ever unfolding. Freedom comes through acceptance and non-resistance. When one stops fighting life's natural flow, including death, the mind becomes peaceful. Fear dissolves and life is experienced with openness and clarity. The fear of death arises in the mind as one of the most profound forms of misunderstanding about existence. It is not simply a fear of an event, but a fear rooted in identification with the body, with memory, with roles, and with the continuous stream of thoughts that create the feeling I. This constructed sense of self appears so real and stable that anything suggesting its ending is experienced as threat. Yet when carefully observed, this sense of stability is revealed to be only a habit of thought, not an actual fixed reality. Life in direct experience is never truly static. It is a movement of changing forms. Sensations arise and dissolve, thoughts appear and vanish, emotions shift without permission. Even the body, which feels so solid and continuous, is in constant transformation at levels beyond immediate perception. Nothing within this field of experience remains unchanged for even a moment. What is called life is therefore not a single object moving through time, but time itself expressing as continuous change. The mind, however, constructs a narrative from this flow. It takes snapshots of experience and weaves them into a story. In this story, there is a central character, a thinker, a doer, a me, who seems to persist across time. This narrative is useful for communication and survival, but it becomes a source of suffering when it is mistaken for ultimate reality. Within the narrative framework, death appears as the final page, the point where the story ends and the character disappears. This creates deep psychological resistance because the mind equates the end of the story with the end of existence itself. But when attention is turned away from narrative and toward direct experience, something very different is found. There is no evidence of a separate, unchanging self that could die. There is only experience happening, seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, each arising in dependence upon conditions. The idea of a permanent observer is itself another thought arising within awareness, not an entity that stands apart from it. When this is seen clearly, the foundation upon which the fear of death rests begins to weaken. Death is feared most strongly when it is imagined as a future event affecting a solid me. Yet in present experience, that future is never actually encountered. What is encountered is only the present moment, and in that present moment there is always life happening, not death. Even the thought of death is alive in the moment it appears. It does not bring actual ending, it brings only mental imagery and emotional response. When this is recognized, fear is revealed to be tied not to reality itself but to imagination. As understanding deepens, the grip of attachment naturally softens. The mind begins to see that everything it clings to is already in motion. Youth, relationships, identity, and possessions are all changing continuously, whether noticed or not. Clinging to what is changing creates constant subtle anxiety, because it is an attempt to freeze what cannot be frozen. When this effort is released, there is not loss but relief. In this relief, a different relationship with life emerges. Impermanence is no longer seen as a threat, but as the natural expression of existence. Just as waves rise and fall without ever leaving the ocean, forms appear and disappear without leaving the field of experience. What is essential is not the persistence of form, but the recognition of the unfolding process itself. From this perspective, death is no longer an absolute ending of something real, but the dissolution of a temporary pattern within a much larger flow. The fear of death, then, is seen as the fear of misunderstanding life. And when life is understood as movement rather than possession, as process rather than object, fear gradually loses its grip, leaving behind a quiet acceptance of change as the very nature of being.